Okay, we're going to get started. If you have stuff you'd like to throw away, I did bring a garbage can over. Our goal today is we have to finish this section because we're, I think, ready to move on. Okay, so Clement of Alexandria. Alexandria is the major city in Egypt. Northern Egypt. It's on the Nile Delta next to the Mediterranean. It's probably the largest city in the world at this time. Remember, it becomes a very important early Christian city. So Clement is one of the first notable bishops. I mean, everyone kind of claims this is the post-apostolic age, so everyone wants their church to be founded by an apostle. By tradition, the church in Alexandria was founded by Saint Mark, but like we've said before, there are probably Christians there before because it was the largest Jewish community outside of the Holy Land, was in this northern part of Alexandria. So Clement is one of the major bishops. He goes from Athens to Egypt, so you could see that there was a lot of commerce between Greece and Egypt. Egypt was Greek-speaking, and they sailed across a lot. Politically, oddly enough, North Africa becomes much more associated with Rome and the West. It follows Roman stuff instead of the Eastern things. We'll get to that in a bit. Clement was one who worked on the integration of classical philosophy with Christian, like classical philosophy and literature with Christianity. He's going to take a lot of the best of pagan philosophy, a lot of the best of the writings of the Greeks, and try and show their connection to Jesus. And because of this, he gets put in charge of an institution that's fantastically important. It's called the Didascalia, but it means like the place of teaching, the place of the disciples. And this school, this sort of institution, if it was still surviving, one could say it'd be like the oldest university in the world. But it doesn't survive that long. But if you've heard of like the Library of Alexandria and the Ptolemies, this is that time. And there was, the Library of Alexandria is a more secular institution in the sense that it's not directly associated with Christianity, but it gives you a sense of how connected Alexandria was with learning. In this city, there were places to study. So he gets put in charge of that, and it's this recognition in early Christianity that if you're going to have teachers and missionaries that you send out into the world, you have to educate them about what they're supposed to teach and be a missionary about, because there is a great amount that can be done from personal experience, but Christian history, like we'll get to later today, is full of people that think they're on the right track and end up in really strange places. And so teaching becomes important, like learning the Christian faith. One of the odd things that would probably surprise most of you is that the idea of like priests going to a seminary to be trained, men going to a seminary to be trained, only comes from the time of the Council of Trent in the late 1500s. There wasn't a formal program of education before that, which had issues. It's not always a good thing. So Clement wants to encourage the pagans to give up their beliefs. Next guy is named Origen of Alexandria. So this is another guy from Alexandria. He gets put in charge of this catechetical school. We have the problem with him that it's really hard to know exactly what his life was like because he ends up in some kinds of crazy speculation and later gets condemned. But we don't know it's hard to know, you know, if you read the school newspaper about your rivals, you know, in the week before homecoming week, you probably didn't have the nicest things to say about them, right? It's not necessarily a good source of material for what life was like at that school. And that's just like a homecoming rivalry, or you think of some of the football games and some of the college things. This is that to a kind of preeminent degree. We don't know exactly what things were like for him, because lots of the writings that we have about him are from people that didn't like him. And what you'll find happens in history quite often is there's one person who has sometimes crazy ideas, but they're not nearly as crazy as the dumb people that come after them. So it'll start out and someone will have some crazy ideas. This is an experience with liberation theology, for instance. Anyone heard of liberation theology? It really takes root in Central America, and it's a kind of combination of the gospel with a lot of social justice things. The original idea was to push back against these wealthy landowners in Central America that were depriving native peoples of their rights. And there's a sense that the gospel is sort of a call to mission, even in civil society, for people to have rights. And so the founder of liberation theology maintains his connection to Jesus, and he talks about the importance of Jesus, Son of God. He keeps all of the classical teaching. Lots of the people that come afterwards don't. They basically drift much more toward communism, much more toward a rejection of Jesus as the divine Son of God. Jesus becomes like this agent of social change instead of a religious leader. And so you have this sort of odd thing where liberation theology eventually gets condemned by and large, but it's not really a condemnation of the founder, because the founder sort of kept things in order. Yes, Jesus does promote social change and people recognizing their rights, and that whole movement of rejecting slavery and things that have happened. There's a big part of that you can get from the gospel, but he maintains that connection to Jesus. And the people that come after him just kind of chuck it. And so you could read all kinds of condemnations of liberation theology. This happens to Origen, and one of the great puzzles is, by tradition, he castrated himself. Because, the traditional story is that he had some kind of significant struggle with sexual sin and temptation, and he decided to end it all. And that was frowned upon. Nope, you're not supposed to do that. But it would be odd, because Origen pioneers a kind of school of thought where you don't take the gospel quite as literally as we would. So for instance, in the story of the Good Samaritan who takes care of the man who is attacked by robbers and takes him to an inn and gives him 2 coins, and bathes his wounds, and Origen will interpret the story as the Good Samaritan being an example of the soul being washed in baptism and cleansed from sin, and then the 2 coins he calls the Old Testament and the New Testament. It's a very, very spiritualized interpretation of the story. And that's a beautiful way to read the scriptures. You can do that. But it's really, really weird if you have someone that reads everything spiritually, and then you're but in this one instance he was super literal. Maybe. I'm a little bit skeptical. I'm not sure. Part of the problem, too, is that Origen gets into some odd stuff. He starts talking about how God has created the souls of everyone already, and they pre-exist in some kind of eternal, state of suspension, as you will. And then when a person is going to be born, the soul that pre-exists already is united with a new body, and it leaves you scratching your head a little bit. But on the other hand, he is a significant example of learning. He's a great example of the commitment of the early Christians to the scriptures. By the time he was in his 20s, he had memorized large portions of the New Testament. He's the first person. He works on a thing that's called the Hexapla, and it was a translation of the scriptures that set 6 different translations side by side, I think in 3 different languages. And that's what he would preach from. So he would be translating between 3 different languages and 6 different translations as he was speaking. he is probably a kind of genius, somewhat like an Einstein or an Augustine. And I think that this is something that should shock us a little bit and should shake us a little bit, because in this world, they don't have nearly as much access to the scriptures as we do today. And they treasured them far more. Like, the idea of everyone being able to have a Bible would be unbelievable riches that were so far beyond what they could imagine. And lots of us have Bibles that collect dust and don't get read. So he follows some teachers. You can read some of the more particular notes about this. One of the things, this is on page 96, that happens is as persecution is increasing, and if you remember time period wise, this is before the advent of the major Roman persecutions, but there's certainly persecutions in individual areas. He takes a life of greater and greater discipline, greater and greater austerity, and he commits himself very much to fasting and prayer. And again, I think that's an example that's worthy to hold up, that's worthy to imitate, because we easily lose sight of the importance of that. And early Christianity was very convicted that this wasn't just something extra, this was necessary of growing in discipline. So Origen also ends up in the middle of an ecclesiastical fight. So he got into a conflict with his bishop. We don't know exactly what the conflict was. It could have been about this self-castration thing. It could have been about his theology. It could have been because Origen was probably smarter than the bishop and the bishop was jealous. Those kind of things happen in history. We don't know exactly what it was, but for some reason he gets into a fight with his own bishop. So he ends up meeting a bishop of Caesarea, which is over in Israel. Caesarea was that major port on the coast, Caesarea Maritima, that we talked about. Like, if you remember in our study through Acts, that's where Cornelius lived, was a Gentile city. Peter goes through Caesarea, and those kind of stories from the Bible are in that Caesarea. That's where it's talking about. So that bishop he gets along with better, and so that bishop ordains him a priest, which causes his bishop in Alexandria to have like a nuclear meltdown and excommunicate the bishop of Caesarea and say that he's not Catholic and all these things. So it ends up in this giant jurisdictional fight, which is probably tragic. Like, the thought of politics in the church can really annoy people, but it's sort of always been that way. And now it's probably better than it was. There's a pretty incredible number of saints that don't end up getting along with their bishops, and the bishops aren't saints, and the saints are. Later, he dies in the Decian persecution. He's eventually arrested, and he's not actually killed like a martyr, but his health is ruined by the tortures that he underwent, and he never really recovers again. He's not usually regarded as a saint, but that's probably because lots of people that followed him were crazier than he was, and they end up in bigger trouble. Some of the early things about him too, the church has this principle that you don't condemn people for teaching that gets clarified later. So for instance, St. Thomas Aquinas speaks against the Immaculate Conception of Mary. But Thomas Aquinas lived in the 1200s, and the Immaculate Conception wasn't declared final teaching until like 1850, so over 600 years later. So you don't condemn someone like Thomas Aquinas for this position because he was already long dead. Actually, one of the really sad stories in history, there was a pope that an empress really didn't like, and after he died, they dug up his skeleton and they put his skeleton on trial and condemned him. I'm not sure what good that did or what the skeleton offered in his own defense, but that actually happened. I would propose to you that once people are dead, we should leave them rest in peace. We don't need to dig up their skeletons because it doesn't do a lot of good to try a skeleton and sentence them to prison. Okay, into heresies. Heresies. This part, I would encourage you, try not to pull out your hair, because there's a lot of different names and a lot of different terms. So what heresy means is that people who claim to be speaking the truth, but in the case of Christianity aren't. So heresy is opposed to orthodoxy. Orthodoxy means right belief. Orthodoxos, or orthodoxa. It means right belief, right faith. So reliable teaching, like we would say the Catechism of the Catholic Church is an instance of orthodox teaching. That's what it means to be Catholic. That's an outline of the faith. Heresy is the opposite. So one of the major heresies that we'll get to, for instance, is called Arianism. Arianism teaches that Jesus was not God. He could have been a super creature, he could have been higher than the rest of humanity, but Jesus wasn't God. Hopefully you realize that that would be heresy. That's outside of orthodoxy, which is why in our creed that we recite on Sundays, we talk about God from God, light from light, true God from true God, begotten not made. All of that language is from the Arian heresy. Those are all affirmations of things that Arians denied. So in this case, we have to be a little bit careful because there's also a group of believers called the Orthodox, which is a different historical reality than orthodoxy like we're talking about in the context of heresy. It plays into it, but it's different. Does this make a little bit of sense? I hope. Thankfully, lots of heresies are kind of strange and they'll feel strange to you, and that's a good sign. Heresy starts to happen very early in Christian history, though. We see it in places, even in the New Testament. There's people that have beliefs that are mentioned to be outside of orthodoxy, outside of what you should believe. One of the great examples is the Nicolaitans, something, I don't know how you say it. They show up in the writings of John, and we don't know exactly what they are, because I think they only show up in the writings of John. And he talks about in the book of Revelation, like Jesus at one point says, I hate the Nicolaitans. Like, don't follow them. So there are people that are falling away from the right belief into these heresies. Many of the church fathers, on the other hand, profess positions that the church later distances themselves from. Another great example of this is St. Augustine. St. Augustine, in his battle over Pelagianism and some of his other things in the Donatist controversy, ends up taking these positions that are really, really extreme. And later the church kind of walks back from those positions and is like, that's probably too far. We're not going to go all the way there. Like if you encounter John Calvin and you've heard of double predestination, that God can create people that are destined to go to hell. That's one of Calvin's major teachings that underlies a huge part of Protestant theology. That's an extreme Augustinian position that the church later is like, nope, too far. Like, no. Because if you say that God can create people that are going to go to hell, you encounter the problem, do they actually have freedom? And that's really hard to say yes. And if you say no, then you violate a whole bunch of other things in the scriptures. And you turn God into a monster because he can create people for damnation. And like that's actually one of the major theological positions that underlines a huge part of Protestantism today. most of the Reformed theology, Presbyterianism, Anglicanism, after the transformation under Queen Elizabeth and all kinds of other places, it's Calvinist theology. And Calvinist theology says that God can create people to go to hell. And God can create people that are going to go to heaven, basically no matter what they do. And it's a really, really weird position. He pulls it, it's an extreme Augustinian position. So the church doesn't say, Augustine, you're no longer a saint. It just says some of these positions go a bit too far. These battles could be intense. In lots of places, heresy gets caught up in politics. This becomes so exceptionally important that it's almost unbelievable. The battle lines between Orthodox and heretic often end up as political battles. And this happens repeatedly in history and is not really a good sign. Because in a sense, the religious question should be separate from the political one. And that doesn't happen very often. Sometimes they lead to riots, like people actually attack other churches and steal their images and burn things down. And it's not just like nice, stuffy debate at a university where people get up to a podium and have a big stack of papers and argue with each other. That's not the way that debates work in history. It's a lot more violent. And there's a whole stack of heresies that we're going to cover. The major one of the first ones that I would point out is called Docetism. And that means it's about appearance. Jesus didn't really die. He just appeared to die. That causes all kinds of monstrous problems. So in Docetism, Jesus only appears to have a physical body, but he doesn't really have a physical body. And part of it is because it's coming from emphasizing the position that if Jesus is God, God cannot die. That's illogical. It doesn't really make sense. How do we make sense of it? Well, that's where the emphasis on Jesus and the unity of his person comes from. That Jesus is true God and true man, and in his humanity he can die. In his human nature he can die. And this is one of the things that I think is important to see, is that heresies were usually after something that tends to be true. They just take it to a bit of an extreme. They take it too far. The most insidious lies, the ones that work the best, have grains of truth in them. The ones that are just bald-faced lies are really unbelievable, and you're like, no. Lots of us would look with kind of aspersion. I have these friends that are missionaries in northern Iraq, and I mentioned this on Sunday. Like, one of the treatments for COVID that the village people in northern Iraq had was to drink a shot of gasoline. That, I would propose to you, does not cure COVID and can cause other physiological problems. But you see how it's so far outside of what we know to be true that you're just like, no, that doesn't work. On the other hand, the lies that are much more challenging have grains of truth in them, and it's not as apparent where the falsehood is. We don't know exactly what all of the stories are, for instance, but there's lots of things that are said that were lies, and some of them get exposed later. Like, lots of you lived through the thing in Vietnam and the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Bay of Pigs invasion, and there were lots of lies that were told by the government around that, and they're just close enough to the truth that they were believable. January 6th, people talk about the riots in the Capitol and that thing with President Trump when Biden was going to be inaugurated, or before he was inaugurated. Well, it was finally revealed a few months ago that the FBI had dozens of informants and people that they were working with that were actually part and maybe even leading that demonstration. They admitted it in Congress. What the actual truth is, was it a hit operation against President Trump to make him unelectable ever again? We don't know. But the story that was told that it was all just President Trump and that there was no outside intervention also isn't true. That there were people with the intelligence services embedded in that crowd that were agitating for violent takeover. And we live in a world that's very, very hard to know lies from truth. So the major heresy that's going to cause all kind of nightmarish problems, but is really, really funny to us today, is called Gnosticism. This is on the bottom of page 97 and into 98. So Gnosticism is a challenge because Christianity argues against Gnosticism, and modern scholars ask, well, what is it? And the answer is, we don't know, because it depends on who you're reading and what they're saying. It's kind of a blanket group that includes a whole bunch of different things. So Gnosticism is a kind of combination. Syncretism is a problem that happens repeatedly in history. So syncretic beliefs mean like you just take different parts of different religious systems and sort of smash them all together into one thing. So this happens, for instance, with some of the Native American cultures. They take a lot of their traditional beliefs and their ancestor worship and their animal worship, and they sort of smash it into Christianity. And so you can find things that are kind of strange. Where you have like, well, we believe in Jesus as God, but we also pray to the earth spirit. And you're like, I don't think that works. Like that would be outside of Orthodox belief. But syncretism is a problem in a lot of places. When people are converted, when people join the church, they don't leave necessarily everything behind them that they had before. And that can become a challenge. So Gnosticism becomes this kind of odd combination between Judaism and Christianity and mystery religions and Platonism. It sort of takes all of these different beliefs and throws them into a pot and stirs them around, and out comes Gnostic stew. Gnosticism means knowledge, gnosis. Gnosis. I don't know why the Greeks spell things that way. They need some assistance. If you want to go back in time, please teach the Greek people how to spell things. So in Gnosticism, you are saved by knowledge. There's a secret set of hidden information that's given to this group called the elect that isn't available to everyone else. And this becomes a problem in all kinds of places. Christianity has a few tendencies in this area because there are Christian teachings that we say are salvific. So is it salvation by knowledge? And the New Testament argues, no, it's salvation through faith by grace. Salvation is a gift. But there's things that you should know, that God is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, those kind of things, baptism, sacramental life. There's definite pieces of knowledge that are part of the story. Gnosticism is this to a kind of strange degree. Like one of the great examples, Augustine becomes a Manichae for a while. Manichaeism is one of these Gnostic heresies. And in Manichaeism, you have to be a vegetarian, and by eating the fruits and vegetables, you release the spiritual particles in them that are divine so that they can be back in communion with like the divine spirit. And other things trap spiritual particles in the stuff that you make, and that's bad, and you shouldn't do that. Sounds kind of strange, right? I hope so. But if you start thinking about this and you peel away the layers, lots of modern diet science is moving in this direction. Lots of modern young people, like Gnosticism is roaring back into our public debates and into consciousness. Because people believe that if you eat certain things and you do all these things, then your body's natural defense systems are all going to be great and you're going to live forever and on and on and on and on. and they put medical science behind it and studies, and it's sort of repackaged Gnosticism. It's not to say, again, that it's completely wrong. I would say we don't exactly know. I would propose to you that the human body doesn't work that well, and death is actually a good thing. I have no desire to live forever, and I hope you don't either, because after like 80 or 90 years, your body gets kind of worn out. And I don't want to wake up with arthritis forever. No, thank you. I don't, like sometimes people talk about living forever in this world, and it's like, why? It's not all that great. I'd be rather curious what pizza tastes like in heaven, and I'm sure it's better than pizza here. So I think we have to be careful. Gnosticism comes about because they're wrestling with this question: how can there be evil in the world? If there's evil in the world, did God create it? How do you solve this? This is probably the most difficult question in all of Christianity. In the modern world, the way that you usually hear it is, why do bad things happen to good people? And the answers to that are really, really hard. There aren't good answers to it, because sometimes you see people that are innocent of things, some things, although they're not completely innocent, right? Because all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. That's part of what we deal with. But you have to wrestle with this question. There's so much evil in the world. Where does it come from? Did God create it? It sure looks like He did, because if He didn't create it, then why is there so much of it? And so Gnosticism ultimately posits that there are a dual principle. There's like a good God and a bad God. There's a God who loves us, the God of the New Testament, and a God who kind of hates us, the God of the Old Testament. The God of the Old Testament is angry and hates us because we sin and fall short and don't live in covenant with Him. And the God of the New Testament says it's not so bad, and you can be forgiven. And so you have this dualistic creation. You have a dualistic thing that happens that's at the heart of most of Gnostic systems. And again, even the Catechism will say that only the whole teaching of Christianity is capable of answering the question of good and evil. You need everything. You need good creation. You need the fall. You need redemption. You need grace. You need heaven. You need eternity. You need the ultimate judgment and justice of God being meted out over time, because when you look at things in this world that are really, really challenging, they're really, really challenging. Like there's no easy answer to it. There's no easy way around it. You see a young child that's born with chronic heart disease or congenital heart disease, and they basically aren't going to survive. What did they do?